welcome back, everyone. The news ended weird that time. Did you notice how it just kind of stopped?
I was like, did it finish?
Normally they're like, from
Question?
Euros Worldwide, this is FSN.
I don't remember exactly how it ended, but I know he or she, one of them does it.
It's always a British voice that says, from Euros Worldwide, this is FSN.
That's why I was confused.
Right, so welcome back, everyone. In case you didn't know, we are the Dank History Show. I'm Bradley Cooper.
I'm Katie Cooper.
Also known as Brad's wife, or the Valkyrie.
I'll take Valkyrie.
Yeah, you'll take that over 11 years of service. Okay, the joke's dead. I get it. Knock on.
I was just staring at him.
Yeah, giving me the stinker.
Well, that's what happens when you bring it up. It's all Billy's fault.
Exactly, it is. That dang old Billy.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
So, today, the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about World War One, the Great War, the big one.
The first one.
The Electric Boogaloo, the war to end all wars.
The Electric Boogaloo?
Frenchies and Trenchies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, that took me a minute to process what you just said. Frenchies and trenchies.
What? It's a beautiful way of describing it.
It's also really sad.
It is sad.
A little inappropriate.
Yeah, doughboys and... What rhymes with doughboys?
Nope, not doing it.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work. Okay, so... Today we're going to be talking about some particular people in World War One, particularly people on both the Central Powers side and the Allies side. But before, going to have to give a little bit of context on how this thing got started. So, war lasted from 1914 to 1918. It began when a guy named Gavril Princip assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, the Serbian guy. And from there, the complex alliances of Europe began to unravel and explode into a powder keg. As the situation just continued to grow worse and worse, and more people got involved, and it just got bloodier and bigger and messier. Bigger.
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 It got bigger. It was...
That sounds like someone like a kindergartner would say, it got bigger.
It did get bigger. For 4 years.
Yeah, for 4 years. So many people tried to stop it from happening, but there were all sorts of weird coincidences that kept on happening. Like, diplomats would suddenly drop dead before signing anything.
I'm 90% sure that heart attack was not a heart attack.
It was probably something planned.
I bet.
I mean, it's possible. For those who don't know, there was this Russian guy and an Austrian guy got together, these two diplomats, to discuss how to stop the war from happening. And they
went over this like the first week, I think.
Yeah.
But we may have forgotten.
Yeah, and they wrote up a document, but before the Russian guy could sign it, he dropped dead right there of a heart attack, quote unquote.
It was Kira.
Yeah.
From Death Note.
I will write your name in my Death Note.
That explains it. I wonder if that's where they got the idea.
It's possible. I mean,
I doubt it.
Well, there are lots of times. There have been times through history where people just drop dead for no reason, so it would make sense.
Okay.
So,
but not to that degree, though.
Yeah, not like
not
that.
in the middle of a life or death situation.
Oh yeah, nothing like that. So this war would see some of the longest battles in history. One lasted 303 days.
For some reason, I thought you were going to say years. I'm like, it was only 4 years long.
Yeah.
300 years.
300
But
years.
300-something days, that's a whole year. Well,
yeah.
almost a whole year.
Yeah, almost a whole year. The Battle of Verdun from winter to winter, basically. And it's easy to get lost in all the numbers of World War One. You just look at, this X amount of people died, this X amount of battles were fought, there were this many trenches, but we need to remember that each of those people was an individual who had their own stories, their own family, their own, things to say. So obviously we can't talk about everyone, but there are a few people that have sort of stood out over time that some people might know, but others are going to be less familiar. So we're
not personally.
Yeah, not personally, but just have heard of them.
Exactly.
Through popular culture. So the first person we're going...
Or history lessons.
Yeah, or history lessons. Or peanuts. Charlie Brown.
Yes. That's how I learned about him.
Yeah, and that's the very first person we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with the Central Powers. For those of you who don't know, that was Germany, Austria, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria. And the first person we're going to start out is probably the most famous person in all of World War One.
He has a pizza.
Yeah, and that's the Red Baron. He's now known for frozen pizzas.
And Snoopy.
Yeah, the one that Snoopy chases in his doghouse.
Why, though?
Yeah, no one ever questions why Snoopy is flying in his doghouse and why...
And also, why the Red Baron?
Yeah. And it wasn't there one episode of Charlie Brown where Snoopy got shot down and ended up wandering around no man's land?
Yes. I mean, I shouldn't laugh about it, but it was so random.
Yeah. What special was that?
I can look it up. I have no idea.
I feel like it might have been the Halloween one.
It was either Halloween or maybe probably not Thanksgiving because he was making food. I'll look it up.
Yeah,
Hold
Thanksgiving he was busy making
popcorn and toast.
Jelly beans.
And pretzel sticks?
Yeah. I don't get
can't
why they
remember what
complain
else.
so much about it. That sounds like a good Thanksgiving meal.
It does sound good.
So,
It was Christmas episode?
Christmas. Oh. Was it the one where Charlie Brown went to the Christmas party?
No, wait, hold on.
There was one where
hold on. There was...
Or was it the New Year's Eve one? Yeah, that was the one where Charlie Brown he got a assignment where he had to read all of War and Peace.
Yes.
And then write a book report on it.
Because that's what you give a 10-year-old. We give a child War and Peace, which most college students don't even...
Yeah. Oh. Well, you remember even in like that show Arthur, how Mr. Ratburn would just give them thousands of pages to write and read.
Yes.
Gotta love just how intense cartoon elementary schools were. They're like, they
gave them a little too much.
They must have been like prep schools on like crack or something.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it was the Great Pumpkin, maybe? No? I don't know. If anyone can figure out which one where he got shot down and he got sent to no man's land, tweet out to
History
Dank
at Twitter. That's capital H, capital D. So,
I'm still looking. I'm going to randomly burst out with, it was this one.
Yes. So, let me tell you about who the Red Baron actually was. It's all
We're
good.
distracted by peanuts.
Yeah. So, I talked a little bit about him in a previous episode when there was an episode we did on Flight a while back. But this guy, whose real name was Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen. That's a very long name. Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna try.
This guy was born in Prussia, which is eastern part of Germany, in 1892. And as a young man, he joined the cadet school of the German military and initially served in the Prussian Uhlans regiment. That was what they called cavalry in 1911. Now, when World War I broke out in 1914, the 22-year-old Manfred wanted something else to do besides the cavalry because, in his words, it bored him to death. Because cavalry at this time didn't see a lot of action. Most of the time they were scouting or they were going around gathering up food. And in fact, when he signed up for the flight program in mid-1915, he wrote a note said, "I have not gone to war in order to collect cheese and eggs, but for another purpose."
Okay.
I mean, wouldn't you get bored, though, collecting eggs and cheese?
But I like eggs and cheese.
I mean, I do like eggs and cheese, too. Especially, German cheese and French cheese. Good cheeses.
That's true. That's true.
So, when he first joined the flight program, he began work as an observer. And planes back in the day were mainly at first used for scouting. So, there would be one guy flying it, then there'd be another guy with a huge camera just taking pictures of the enemy positions. And that was what he did initially. However, he would eventually move on to become a fighter pilot in training. But his first time actually flying as a fighter pilot and his test run, he actually crashed the plane, which is kind of funny considering his legend. But, he didn't let that hold him back, and he quickly found his wings. And in 1916, he joined a fighter squadron, and that was, for those who don't know, a group of people and fighters who flew together. And during this time, he shot down his first Allied aircraft. And immediately after doing that, he called a jeweler in Berlin and he said, I want a silver cup with this date and the type of the Allied aircraft I shot down. So even then, the guy had a bit of an ego, but this was almost sort of like a prophecy of the sort of legend he would gain. And he would continue downing other pilots. And he famously downed a flying ace named Lano Hawker, who had 9 aerial victories. Now, just for some context of what it meant to be a flying ace, you had to have 5 confirmed kills. And that didn't necessarily mean you killed the guy, just mean you shot down his plane. Most of the time it meant the person died, but sometimes it didn't.
Well, you don't know after that.
Yeah.
Because they're probably in a bush.
Yeah. So he would just continue to just build up and rank up his victories. And he even got to take over a German flying group in April 1917. And during this time, he would lead this massive campaign against the Allied fighter pilots in the sky. And his group would actually earn the title of Flying Circus. And that was because they would do these really complex maneuvers together that really looked like how a circus performers would do it. Like you might see like an elephant come out with, all the acrobats and everyone in a certain formation or something like that. And in April of 1917, the Germans got so good at, shooting down Allied aircraft that the average life expectancy for a British pilot during this time dropped from like 200 hours to about 92 hours. So this was known as Bloody April, actually. And I just saw someone walk by T-posing, so...
That's the second time that's happened.
That's the second time that's happened.
Congratulations.
They're embracing the Dank. So, the reason why he got the title Red Baron, there's someone else T-posing. Why do we get so many T-posers? Is it just because of the Dank, you think?
No.
Or is it just because it's the Gen Z?
Attention.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Continue.
Okay, so... During this time, he got the title Red Baron due to his red biplane, which was called a Fokker. And no, that is not the bad word. That's just how it sounds. I had to specify, because otherwise, I don't want Matt to come in saying, Brad, you can't use that word on the radio.
Yes, you can. It was around in the what year was that?
1917.
1917.
Yep. So, the Fokker Drive 2, that was his plane.
Fokker.
Yes, German word. Now, all legends do eventually come to an end, and on April 21st, 1918, his flying circus took off, and Manfred went after another Allied plane, but he was shot, not by, interestingly enough, by another plane, but by a sniper on the ground.
So the World War I flying ace, Snoopy, did not take him out. It was somebody else.
No, unfortunately. And by this point, he was probably flying pretty low to the ground. I think his plane had actually gotten damaged at this point.
Well, that would make sense for him to go down by a sniper then.
Yeah.
Especially if they don't have the technology we have today.
No.
Sniping wouldn't be able to get somebody from far away.
Yeah. And at this point, none of their planes had cockpits. You were just sitting like, your head poking out in the open. Mm-hmm. So things would get pretty cold up in the sky.
Yes, they would.
What are you laughing about?
So how far up could they go if they had no cover?
Yeah.
I feel like you went over this when we did planes, but I can't remember.
I don't think they could have gone up more than probably honestly 3,000 feet. I honestly don't know for sure because the further up you go, the colder it gets, and that's just impossible.
And if you're too bundled up, you can't stare.
Yeah, and if you stay far. Sometimes people would try to sneak through the clouds, but you'd catch frostbite really quickly if you did that. Yeah. So. Especially during the winter. So what's interesting about the Red Baron is when the Allies found him, they actually had a lot of respect for him because, the flying aces were considered sort of the more honorable, almost like knights of the sky compared to the people on the ground where it was just bloody and horrible. So even though flying had a very high casualty rate, everyone sort of wanted to more be in the sky rather than to be stuck on the ground.
Well, it's more glorious.
Yeah,
you're kind of your own person up there, whereas on the ground, you're kind of one of many.
Exactly. That is how it goes. And when the Allies found him, they gave him a military funeral, and by the end of his life, he had 80 confirmed kills, and that is more than
impressive.
Anyone else in World War I. So, pretty impressive guy. Now, the next person we're going to look at is someone who's maybe not as impressive, and he has a bit of a mouthful of a name, but we're going to try to get through it. And that is a guy named Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf. I'm sure there's a joke that could be made.
I'm not going to try.
You're not going to try to make a joke?
No.
Hotzendorf.
How dare you?
I know. That was
How
mean.
Dare you?
That was mean. I'm sorry, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf. So, this was a guy. He was basically the head of the Austro-Hungarian army. And he's really very responsible for sort of getting the war kicked off because he was very much dedicated to the idea of expansion. But before we talk about that, we have to give some context. So, this guy was born all the way back in 1852 in Austria. So, for context, that's about 11 years before the American Civil War began. So he was already, in his 60s when World War I broke out. Mm-hmm. And he came from a very long line of officers and people in the military. For example, his father had actually fought against Napoleon all the way back in the early 1800s. So he too would join the military, and he would help fight off in many battles, and later he would instruct many students in military academies, and as well write books on strategy. And he would later come under the wing of one Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who...
That sounds so familiar.
The guy who got shot and got... Is that the guy? Is that Sam? Sorry, the TV's playing here. I just saw Sam from Lord of the Rings back in the 90s.
They just showed a clip of Rudy.
Okay, Rudy. I didn't know he was in that movie.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Rudy.
Anyway. So,
wow, we got distracted.
Yeah, we got distracted easily. So he'd come under the wing of this guy, and he helped him become the chief of staff of the army. Now, Conrad had certain ideas that were a bit controversial, and his ideas was, he said, Austria-Hungary needs to expand and needs to strike against everyone. And he says he wanted preemptive wars against both Italy and Serbia. And his idea was, let's fight off all the smaller countries and take them over before the Russians could come to our aid. And the emperor at the time, Franz Joseph...
That couldn't end well.
No, it couldn't end well at all. He wanted peace, but Conrad just kept on putting his foot in his mouth and kept on demanding, all these things. So he had kind of a tense relationship with the upper crust there in Austria-Hungary.
As you do.
But when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, Conrad got the war he wanted, but he was really unprepared, to say the least. For example, he didn't really understand how modern weaponry would really work on the battlefield. Stuff like machine guns, or huge artillery pieces, or poison gas and things like that. And not only this, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire was very heavily behind the times. The state of the army at that point was they were probably fighting like how people from the 1870s would have fought. So, not necessarily the best position. And initially, when World War I started, he made a lot of bad tactical decisions, and the Austro-Hungarians got beaten very badly by both the Russians and the Serbians. And Conrad's idea was, well, we need to just keep on fighting, we just need to keep making offenses, we'll drive them out eventually. And that just ended up with a lot of people dead and nothing much accomplished. And Conrad would have to turn to their German buddies to help them out, who would kind of bail them out and help them conquer Serbia and drive the Russians back. However, Conrad's relationships with both the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans really deteriorated because he was a guy who really sort of was his way or the highway, and that really didn't mesh well with other people. He kept on arguing that they were going to annex more and more territory from their enemies, which people didn't really want to do that because that's more territory to manage, and also it's
pretty difficult.
It's difficult also in the negotiation. If you want all that, it's going to be hard to get that. So when the Emperor Franz Joseph who had to spin around all this time. I think he had been alive since like the very early 1800s. So he died in 1916. His heir, Karl I, the very last emperor of Austria-Hungary, by the way, told Conrad at his inauguration that, hey, I'm going to replace you because we haven't gotten anything done. We've just been falling apart. So Karl ended up taking direct control of the army. Am I too far close?
Yeah, a little bit.
Sorry, everyone, if I'm screaming your ear off. I'll just start.
It's all right.
Scratching on the table.
Don't do that.
Okay, I won't. So he ended up getting sort of shuffled around. He was placed on the Italian front, where he basically Hotzendorfed it up again and failed, until he was dismissed completely in 1918, right before the end of the war, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire completely imploded and became 7 different states. Like, if you look at a map of what Austria-Hungary looked like back then and what Austria looks like today, it's just bizarre, because it's just like this huge chunk, and now it's like this tiny little... I don't even know what shape. It looks like a ladle, honestly. Like a little tiny ladle. And what's interesting about him is that after the war, he continually denied responsibility for any of the failures. And in fact, he would just blame the imperial court for not listening to his brilliant ideas. And his lack of understanding the modern war and his arrogance and his desire for war really sabotaged himself and the Austrians constantly. So he's really more of he's an example of the type of person who was in charge of World War I that fought it like they were still fighting in the 1700s and led to a lot of people dying. So that's him, but we're going to move on to someone who I think is a little bit more interesting, and that is an artiste. An artiste, a guy named Otto Dix, D-I-X. And this is a guy you might have seen.
Another word that we're okay with on the radio.
Yes, we are okay with saying that on the radio.
Because that's the man's name.
That's the man's name. All these German words just sound like bad words, cuss words. But
I wonder why.
Well, I mean, most of the curse words are Germanic in origin, Saxon.
Oh, that's true.
Makes sense. All our nice words are French. Well, I talked about that in our very first episode.
Yes, you did.
Yep. So this guy was an artist who lived in Germany, and he wrote something very interesting. I just want to read you this quote. He said, "All art is exorcism. Painting is the attempt to produce order in yourself. There is much chaos in me, much chaos in our time." And this German artist said this specifically to his experiences about World War I. Now, for some context, this guy was born in 1891 to a working-class family, and he got an apprenticeship to a painter and was able to sort of build himself up and later studied at the University of Dresden. And during this time, he was exposed to many famous expressionist paintings. Like, there's one that everyone will probably recognizes, and that's Edvard Munch's famous painting, The Scream. That's the one where that guy's, like, has got his hands on his face, his mouth open like this.
Yes, listeners. Yeah. You can see him right now.
It sort of looks like an alien doing that. It's almost anyone would recognize it if you saw it.
I guess you could post a picture on the Twitter page.
Yeah, I'll probably do that. And meeting up with this expressionist paintings, and expressionism was all about not as much like making it look super accurate, but more in creating an expression, almost like a feeling.
It more invokes feeling than a realistic painting does.
Yeah, like the picture almost appear kind of cloudy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Because emotions are complicated. They're not as straightforward.
Yes, exactly. And this would heavily influence his painting. And another thing that would influence his painting is obviously World War I. He volunteered to fight when World War I broke out in 1914. And he would join up in 1915 and fight all the way throughout the entire war, all the way to 1918. And
kudos to him.
Yeah, and not many people did that and were able to come up alive. And he would actually win the Iron Cross Second Class, and that was basically one of the highest military honors for bravery. However, he was deeply affected by it. And if you look up some of his paintings, he would draw many paintings of it that almost look kind of demonic. Like he's got this one of German stormtroopers that just looks very weird and very twisted. And his trauma from this conflict would appear in as many of his paintings. Like his paintings, because of this, become increasingly political, such as protesting against the treatments of those who had been crippled by the war. And in the 1920s, after the war was over, he would join with a group of artists who had also been in the trenches to put on an exposition called No More War that would show anti-war paintings. One of them is called Der Krieg, which is like a triptych. If a triptych is like one painting, but basically 3 different parts. And it was just called The Trenches, and it shows the beginning of the war to the end. It's very, very interesting, haunting, but very also beautiful in a way.
Do you know how long it took for him to paint it?
I don't know how long it took for him to paint it, but he started painting these almost as soon as the war was over, these paintings. So
it could either be a therapy or he could be reliving these horrible things and it didn't help.
Yeah, it could be a little...
Depends on how he handled it.
Yeah, a little mixture of both. And what's interesting is that this guy actually lived all the way through the 60s and through when Nazi Germany came to power. So when Hitler rose to power, he actually had a lot of Dix's art destroyed, and that's because Hitler really didn't like modern art and anti-war art being...
He was also jealous.
Yeah, very jealous.
Because, this guy got to be an artist and he couldn't.
Yeah, his art really sucks if you ever looked at it. It looks like something a teenager would draw. So it makes sense.
Yeah, that's why he didn't end up in art school.
Exactly.
And he's mad.
Yep. So Dix, interestingly enough, he could have left Germany and immigrated somewhere else, but he decided to stay. And the reason is that he didn't think he would be able to transport his paintings without them being destroyed, and he wanted to keep them. So he stayed in Germany. Now, he was too old to be basically drafted early on, but later in the war, around 1945, he was forcibly enlisted into the German army. And the reason for that is that by the end of the war in 1945, World War II, this is, totally different one, Germany was surrounded on both sides. The United States, the French, and the British were advancing on the west. The Russians were moving in. So the Germans began to recruit a lot of old men and basically teenagers, like as young as 12 years old, from the Hitler Youth into the army.
That's so sad.
Yeah, if you ever watch the movie Downfall, it shows a scene about that where there's just like a bunch of like 10-year-olds, boys and girls, just being like, we're going to be great and all these heroes and stuff. And,
that's so sad.
Yeah, pretty sad. Hitler Youth was basically evil Boy Scouts. So. Although there's a movie coming out that's a comedy about that called, what is it called? JoJo.
Oh, I saw the trailer for it.
Yeah, the guy who did Guardians of the Galaxy. It looks hilarious.
It looks weird.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd be able to watch it without, I don't know.
Well, the guy who plays Hitler is Jewish in the movie, which makes sense. It's kind of like, what's the name of that guy who did Blazing Saddles?
Oh.
I will remember his name, but it's the same sort of concept. The Jewish film director who used Nazi jokes a lot. But anyway, back to Otto Dix. So near the end of the war, he was actually captured by the French, and he was kept in a prison camp for a while until he was released. And after that, he got back to painting. And he painted up until his death in the 60s. And one of his pieces that's really stood out is his piece of art, Der Krieg. And this one author, G.H. Hamilton, described it this way. He said, "It's perhaps the most powerful as well as the most unpleasant anti-war statements in modern art. It was truly this quality of unmitigated truth to the most commonplace and vulgar experiences, as well as the ugly realities of psychological experience, that gave his work a strength and consistency unattained by no other contemporary artist." So definitely someone to look into if you're interested in art. So
you gotta wonder how he made it through being in 2 wars.
Yeah, I think that shows to the power of, art and expression, of being able to just pour that emotion and experience into something creative. So, pretty interesting guy. So, now we're going to talk about some allies as well. And for this, we're going to follow the same pattern we did for the Central Powers. We're going to talk about one military commander, one soldier, and one artist. So, the military commander we're going to talk about is probably the second most famous person from World War I other than the Red Baron. And that is because of a movie called Lawrence of Arabia. And this guy's...
which I started watching when I was a teenager and never finished because I fell asleep.
We should watch it.
Listeners, you will find that there's a lot of movies that I've started and fell asleep.
That's true. Didn't you fall asleep during The Matrix?
I did.
And Kingdom of Heaven.
And Kingdom of Heaven.
And The Hobbit. But to be fair, you had a very long day.
I had just finished finals, and we were going to go see The Hobbit at midnight.
That's true.
And I was exhausted.
Yeah. That one's a pass.
That one I did rewatch, though. So I need to rewatch Matrix and
Lawrence of Arabia.
I almost said T.E. Lawrence.
Yeah. So that was his full name. And his full name was Thomas Edward Lawrence. He was born
T.
He was...
I'm sorry.
That's funny.
Mr. Lawrence? What was his title?
It would just be Mr. Lawrence.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Lawrence. I didn't mean to laugh at your name.
This guy was born in 1888 in Wales, and he's I consider him sort of a kindred soul, because he gained a very interest early on in medieval history and military strategy.
That doesn't sound anything like you. Guys, he has like these little miniature men that he plays games where he sets up like war and battles and
yeah.
Now sometimes he'll play by himself.
Sometimes I'll play with a friend.
Sometimes he will play with a friend.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time he plays by himself.
Now, remember, they are not toys. They are military miniatures.
They will help you.
Yeah, and you have to paint them and put them together. So they're an artistic project as well.
And he's gotten really good. He's getting really good with the details.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. So this guy, interested in medieval history and military strategy, and because of that, he would join military school, and he would actually get himself a job in Palestine, modern day, Israel and Palestine, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, after the war broke out, because the Ottoman Empire was at war with Britain, he had to go back to Cairo in Egypt, which was under British control. And at first, he had a job like helping encode and decode telegrams, because he was really into that. So the British at this time, during World War I, they needed something to help them against their campaign against the Ottomans in the Middle East, because they had tried and hadn't done so well. So they began work with one guy whose name was Hussein bin Ali. This guy was the Sharif, basically a term which means leader, of Mecca. That's the most holiest city in all of Islam, for those who don't know, located in modern-day Saudi Arabia. And they offered to help him create an Arab state if he helped them against the Ottomans. And this Arab state would include all of Arabia, Syria, and Palestine.
So this Welsh guy was doing this?
This Welsh guy hadn't got involved yet. The British government was doing this.
The British were doing this.
Yes, but here's the thing. Their promises to this guy, Hussein bin Ali, were largely empty because they had secretly made an agreement, all the allies among themselves, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to split up all of the Middle East for themselves. So this was a major lie. So they chose T.E. Lawrence to help supervise these Arab revolters because he kind of knew the region, he knew the language. And when Lawrence first arrived in these Arab camps, he thought they were largely too independent to fight well in the team. Like, they were brave by themselves, but they didn't really know how to work together really well. So at first he came up with an idea, well, let's just try to sabotage the Ottoman Empire's railway system. But they had a lot of problems to deal with. One was that a lot of the Arabic people weren't really interested in joining up. Another was they didn't have enough supplies. But they continued to do these things, and they were able to make some success. For example, they were able famously to take out the Hejaz Railway, which ran from Arabia all the way to Damascus. Now, T.E. Lawrence was actually ordered to stay quiet about the true British plans of what they planned to do with Arabia, for which he really expresses a lot of regret about in his book called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which is...
There's no way this can end well.
No. The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, by the way, that's a reference to the book of Proverbs, where I think there's like 7 pillars of wisdom that are mentioned throughout Proverbs. So, in October 1918, the Arab Revolt was able to achieve some success. They were able to enter Damascus, but they found out, the British were planning to split up among themselves. And T.E. Lawrence, after this, he would begin telling many stories about his exploits. And some of these stories were certainly true, but some of them were very much exaggerated. Like, he claimed that there was this huge bounty on his head all throughout the Ottoman Empire, for which there's no evidence. And he also tells this kind of bizarre story where he claimed he was captured and sexually assaulted by this commander in this fortress. And that certainly could have happened, and we're not saying it didn't, but considering sometimes his track record of making up stories to make himself appear more larger than life, that could have been made up, but hard to say. Now, his legacy today remains a bit mixed. For example, the Arab world did not get its country it wanted, and it was split up between Syria, Iraq, and all sorts of areas. And that split, which was caused by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, is still the cause of many problems in the Middle East today. Like, if you look at Iraq right now, how it's kind of, divided between Sunnis and Shias, well, that's because Iraq really wasn't really even a country or an idea before the British and French basically made it up. So,
again, there was no way this could have ended well.
Yeah, no way it could have ended well.
Good job, Lawrence.
Yeah. Now,
sorry, T.E.
Yeah, T.E. It's hard really to say about his legacy, because on the one hand, how much could he have done? But on the other hand, it still is kind of a lie, so it's tricksy.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm at a loss of what to say about this.
Yeah, definitely. Although he did.
What do you think this would have happened if they had just left them alone? I know you said that the West kind of encouraged the state, whatever, creating countries. Do you think that would have happened organically, or do you think that it really was their fault?
I think it honestly was their fault, because if it just happened organically, yes, of course, there's always going to be conflict and there's always going to be problems. But you wouldn't have the unique conflict that was created today of all these, nations that were created in a very weird way. Like, okay, if you look at a map and the way borders are drawn, sometimes, the borders of, France and Germany, they seem very natural. Like, they follow, mountains or something. The lines aren't straight. They're sort of bendy. If you look at a map of the Middle East, you notice all the lines are very straight and very,
straight-ish.
Yeah,
I don't
straight-ish.
think they're perfectly straight.
Yeah, but they're much more geometrical, which is, that's a problem. That shows you that it really wasn't drawn with, geography in mind or actual borders in mind. And the same thing goes for Africa as well, if you look at some of those nations. So it certainly didn't cause every problem in that region, but it did lead to a lot of issues. Like, for example, the more moderate Arab state never took over, and another group, the Sauds, who we know today as Saudi Arabia, who were very much extremists. They followed a ideology called Wahhabism. They ended up taking over the whole region of Arabia and Saudi Arabia today and all its problems. So definitely a mixed legacy. But let's move on past the commanders and talk about a soldier. And this one, we've been talking about a lot of dudes today, but now we're going to talk about a woman. Yeats.
Represent.
We're going to talk about a woman whose name was, I'm going to butcher her last name, so please forgive me, Maria Bochkareva, and the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death.
I was all excited until the last 2 words of death.
It's a pretty cool name.
Is it because of their death, or they caused death?
We will explain that in a moment.
Oh my.
Yeah.
I didn't. Guys, I don't read the notes before I get them. So if I accidentally go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Spoilers are okay. I mean, you can look up all this. There's no such thing as spoilers with history.
I'm that person who asks questions because I don't follow it, or I do follow it, or I ask questions that somebody would.
Hey,
That's why I don't read the notes.
It helps us make sure we actually use up all our time. So
that's why you love me.
Yep.
I ask so many questions.
It's good to ask questions. That's how you learn. So for some context, in 1917, the Russian world was really falling apart around everyone due to revolts upending everything. And during this time, there was this one woman named Maria. Now, Maria was born as a peasant girl who had a very troubled life. She got married when she was very young, ended up leaving her husband, who was abusive, and running off with a lover who ended up getting himself arrested not once but twice because he was involved in all these schemes. But she was a very independent and strong-willed individual. So when the war broke out, she actually decided she was going to try to join the army.
Were they allowing women in the Russian army?
No, not at all. Not at all. This was still Tsarist Russia. There was no way they would allow it. But she was refused, but she was not one to take no for an answer. So she telegrammed Tsar Nicholas II himself, sent a telegram, and asked him, hey, I want to join up. And I guess he was in a good mood, so he said, okay, that's fine, I'll agree to it.
But Tsar Nicholas II, he had daughters. Would he have sent them off to war? That's a good
question. Know. But also,
I wonder why he did.
Well, I guess she was probably really insistent, and if you're just sort of impressed by someone's tenacity.
That's true.
Yeah. If someone's just that tenacious, it's like, oh, okay. So she was very naturally strong and was a good sniper. And although
she probably put that in the letter.
Yeah. Although she was often harassed by the other men, she really proved her mettle in battle. Now, in 1917, and she was still in the army this time, she was really dismayed by how the Russian army was breaking down. And that was because there had been one revolution that happened, not the communist one. There was one before that one called the February Revolution. And because of this, the Russian army was really going downhill because, it was so unstable, the country. So in order to make up for this, the government that had taken over at the time, under a guy named Kerensky, the Kerensky government, they began to deploy shock battalions known as death battalions. And these were groups, their goal was to basically fight to the death and be incredibly aggressive. And Maria wanted the women to fight up as well. So
was this just a Russian thing, or were there a lot of death battalions in the other?
There were a lot of shock battalions, and there were a lot of them that sort of had that sort of aesthetic. Mm-hmm. Like if you look at a lot of the battalions of World War I, as the war goes on, the battalions and their imagery and the flags they use, they get a lot more like what's the word I'm looking for? Like not gruesome, but yeah, I guess gruesome. Like you'll see
That's
a lot.
Probably the closest word.
You'll see a lot more skull and crossbones on things. You see a lot more
morbid.
Yeah, more morbid. That's the word I'm looking for. Just because as the war goes on and people just get more and more desensitized how bad it gets, and that sort of leads to that sort of idea. So Maria wanted to create her own women's death battalion, and she sent a whole lot of letters, and eventually the guy in charge, Alexander Kerensky, got permission to do it.
She really does well with those letters.
Yeah.
I need to figure out how to be more persuasive like her.
You do. We all do.
Bradley.
I mean, I'm just saying we all could use more persuasive skills. I could learn how to be more persuasive. But you're very persuasive, naturally.
Keep going. He's still digging a hole.
I'll dig my way out of it.
At some point, I'm sure.
At some point. You're awesome.
Anyway.
Yeah. So, she asked for women, and she asked specifically for this, whose hearts are pure crystal, whose souls are pure, and whose impulses are lofty.
Wait, hold on. Did she tell them that they were going to die? Or was it...
Okay.
That seems like false advertising.
So... I don't think it was necessarily like you were...
Was she going to tell them that they were going to war?
Yes. I mean, yeah, she was asking them to sign up for this battalion.
Hearts as pure as... hearts are pure as crystal. Souls are... I don't get it.
She was asking for women of basically that sort of character. Self-sacrificing.
Okay, yeah. That makes more sense. I thought you meant like pure little princesses.
No, not like that.
That doesn't make any sense.
Think more like moral vigor when you hear that.
That makes way more sense.
Think more of
what I was
the
thinking.
Russian sense, not like the Western European,
That's
pretty
true.
princess.
That's
like
fair.
Moral vigor. Like
I guess I'm looking at it through a Western lens.
Yeah.
So that's how I was confused.
Like a warrior type who's pure of heart, like Aragorn or somebody from Lord of the Rings.
You just used a man.
Or Eowyn.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I am mad at you right now.
Eowyn and Arwen and the other shield maidens.
How dare you?
I know. I'm sorry.
The only warrior princess in the books.
Well,
there were others.
There were others.
The most famous warrior princess.
I'm sorry. I have created a great evil.
I am mad right now.
So back to her death battalion. So 2,000 women answered the call, but she would only recruit about 500 of them because she wanted them that were sort of the best fit, that really fit sort of that vigorous training program she had in mind. So these women would go to the front lines, and they fought the Germans on July 10th, 1917, at the Battle of Smorgon.
Smorgon?
And by the end of that fifth day of that battle, many of them were either dead or wounded. But Maria herself actually got a promotion to lieutenant, and her battalion were able to capture over 100 prisoners. Which gained them a lot of fame because, and the world reported on this, like even U.S. newspapers were reporting on this woman's death battalion. And during the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened in 1917 and Russia left the war, she actually visited the United States, where she met up with none other than President Woodrow Wilson.
She got around.
Yeah, she went around, and she asked him to intervene in Russia to help sort of restore the monarchy. And she also, while she was there in the United States, she wrote her memoirs in New York about her experiences. Eventually, she went to London. She got funding to go back to Russia, where she served in the White Russian Army, which was the anti-communist forces. But unfortunately, she was captured and executed by the Bolsheviks. But her dedication and passion and her refusal to take no for an answer was really pretty inspiring, I have to say.
I admire her.
Yeah, she was a strong woman. For sure. So, last person we're going to talk about today is someone else that a lot of you might know if you grew up involved in fantasy literature, I guess. Is the right word? Is that the right word?
I think so.
Yeah. So, or you were homeschooled.
Yes.
Yeah. Frodo was your only friend.
That is very true.
And that just gave away who it was. We are talking about J.R.R. Tolkien.
Oh. Say it again?
J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm sorry.
Even the great Stephen Colbert, who is the biggest Tolkien fan, still pronounces it Tolkien.
Yeah.
So I'm okay if you go to Tolkien.
Yeah, that's true. It's just I grew up hearing it that way. For context, we watched the Tolkien movie, where they made it clear that that's how you pronounce it, which seems wrong. But
seemed a little pretentious, but,
yeah,
it's all
whatever.
right.
This guy's name was John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And
that's a name.
He's most famous for writing Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but he was also a soldier in World War I for Britain. So this guy was born in 1892 in South Africa. And his mother eventually took him to England when he was very young because his father was very sick and he ended up dying in South Africa. And J.R.R. Tolkien was initially homeschooled by his mother, but she actually did teach him many things like Latin, botany, and reading. So, he wasn't just sitting all day, reading, I don't know. What would be an example?
Oh, there is a stereotype that homeschoolers don't actually do anything. And for some people, it's true. For other people, they actually do work.
Yeah, like I had to do.
His mother actually gave him an education.
Yeah, like I actually had to do work. I was homeschooled, so he grew up in England at a farm called Bag End, interestingly enough. And for those who don't know, that's the same name as the place where Frodo and Bilbo Baggins lived at, in Bag End in the Shire.
We're slightly nerdy.
Just a little bit. I mean, we are talking about Dank history.
I know.
So.
I was like, why am I even trying to justify
No, we only talk about jock history here. Nothing but sports balls.
To be fair, sports history is very interesting.
That is true. And we might
could tackle that at some point.
Yeah, we might do that one. And an episode in the history of rock. And roll.
Granite? Oh, okay.
Granite. Granite. That was good.
The history of rock. Pumice.
I mean, you can talk about rocks. That's geology. So his mother at Bag End would tell him many stories and fairy tales, and he himself began imagining his own stories. And what's interesting is that his mother actually converted to Catholicism away from Protestantism, which led her family to disown her, because that still in those times that was considered, you don't want to do that.
In some circles.
And J.R.R. Tolkien actually joined her in that faith, which would continue to be his faith for the rest of his life. Now, his mother died suddenly at the age of 34 due to complications which we now know are caused by diabetes, Which, interestingly enough, after that, Tolkien actually became more intense with his faith, which is really interesting when you compare him to his contemporary C.S. Lewis, who became an atheist after his mother died.
Were they about the same age?
Yes, just about. So he became quite the learned kid, and he learned many languages, even made up some languages of his own. Like in 1911, he took a journey with 12 friends to Switzerland, where he got the inspiration for the Hobbit book. So his experiences really shaped him.
I'm glad he took the... Well, hold on. It was 12, 13... It was like 14, wasn't it?
But wasn't it 12 dwarves?
It was 12 dwarves, Gandalf, and Bilbo.
Maybe there was someone else.
Because they didn't want 13. That's why they grabbed him.
Okay.
I think so.
Maybe he had a teacher join with him. I don't know.
That would be interesting.
So another big part of his life is he had a very intense romantic interest in a woman called Edith. And she actually lived with him in basically this, it wasn't really an orphanage, but it was like a foster home. They lived together under this woman. And he had a Catholic guardian who was a priest, and he actually forbade Tolkien from speaking to her because she was a Protestant and because he needed to focus on his studies, apparently. And what's interesting about this is that Tolkien obeyed this rule until he was 21, and he contacted her and asked her to marry him. And she agreed, actually breaking off an engagement with another guy. And what we actually learned is that they all got together, her fiancé, and him, and they came to an agreement where this made sense. So that was nice.
So it's less Romeo and Juliet and more, here you go, I'm stepping back.
Yeah, more like that.
As of her fiancé.
Yes. Now, he actually said he was impressed that she agreed to marry him because he had no money, no job, and the Great War had just broken out, so he didn't expect to live through that.
What would she have done after? I guess, well, unless he found somebody else, she could have gone back to...
Yeah, she could have gone back to the other guy, or maybe if there was a War Widows Fund. There probably wasn't, but there might have been.
She wouldn't have been married at that point.
So,
were they married before he left?
Yes, right before.
Okay.
So shortly after he got married, he was sent to the front to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. That was in France. It was in the British sector where they were launching an offensive against the Germans. And he didn't really expect to survive this battle. And at first, when he joined up, he thought that the Germans were evil and that they were just absolutely bad to the core, because that's what he was taught. But as he was in there a while, he began to revise his thoughts, and he realized there was good and evil on all sides of the war. And all of his friends from the Harvard University went with, not Harvard, Oxford. I got to Harvard's in the U.S.
Harvard is in the United States.
Wow, that was bad, yeah. So, most of his university friends actually died in that battle, and he was actually sent back home, and I wrote this wrong, I say he caught typhus. He actually caught something called trench fever.
Which was caused by lice. I had to look it up. It was really gross.
Yeah, lots of people got that because you're in the mud all the time in trenches with a lot of blood and a lot of people dying, and you're all packed together.
And there's bugs everywhere.
Bugs everywhere. People are probably urinating and defecating everywhere too, so it's just really gross.
This is why we need a good plumbing. What is the word I'm looking for?
Plumbing system.
Plumbing system. Waste system.
Yes.
Waste management is important. If you are a garbage man or a plumber or somebody who works in pipes, we salute you.
Yep.
We do not want trench fever.
No. Or trench foot, which you got from it, because your foot would constantly be in all the mud and the moisture. You tend to mess with your feet too. Yeah, it kind of sucked.
Thank you to all of those people.
Yep. So he got sent home because he caught the trench fever. And during this time, during the war and after, he began thinking up the story behind the Silmarillion, which is actually, that's the big mythology of the Lord of the Rings. It's the big
It's
prequel.
Huge.
And it's beautiful.
And you have your own mythology that you're working on.
Yes. I'm always working on it.
It's excessive.
Mythology is fun.
It is fun.
Yeah. And it was drawn from all sorts of sources, like Germanic, Norwegian, his Christian background as well.
Now, did he do this because he wanted new stories for a new age?
Yeah.
Or new legends? Or was it just because he really loved this?
Yeah, he definitely wanted to create something that was sort of like a new mythology for England. Because England, it didn't really have any mythologies of its own. It was all borrowed stuff. Like Robin Hood comes from Wales. King Arthur is Welsh.
Gotta love the Welsh.
Yeah, the Welsh are pretty cool. So after the war, he moved with him and his family back to Oxford, and there's been a lot of speculation on how his experiences in World War I really affected his creativity. And we do know that some parts were directly came from that, like in The Lord of the Rings, I think it's the Two Towers, when Frodo and Sam and Gollum are going through this place called the Dead Marshes.
Oh.
They see all these dead faces from this battle. And that obviously is directly inspired by the trenches. And also Mordor itself with its dark corridors and flames. Obviously that's inspired a little bit from war. And also industrialization. He really loved living in the farm in Baggin, and he hated living in London with all the factories and everything. So,
did he ever attempt to move back?
I think he mostly stayed in Oxford.
Especially if he was a professor.
Yeah. So that was certainly one inspiration for his book. But there are many others, like his mother's stories, his love of languages and his Catholic faith. And also, just his love for his family, his wife. And what's very interesting is on his gravestones for him and his wife are the names of two characters from his book, and they are Luthien and Beren. And that was a name of a man and an elf who were lovers back in the Silmarillion. So
he loved her.
Yeah. And you could tell he definitely had a type because all of the beautiful women in the book are described as pale and with black hair.
Was Edith pale and
yes.
dark? Okay,
yes.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And that was actually the ideal beauty in Celtic mythology.
Okay.
Which is, if you know, sometimes the ideal beauty in a culture is whatever is the rarest.
Interesting.
Like in Italy, sometimes it's the person with red hair or the blonde because that's rare. Whereas you go further north, it's like the person with dark hair because that's rare.
What about an eclectic country like the United States?
We have a variety of people that are considered attractive there. I mean, obviously, tan blondes are attractive,
That's
but also,
true. Well, tan blondes are rare because when you're blonde, you tend to be more fair skinned.
Yeah, you tend to burn. So that was our last episode of World War One.
That was an adventure.
It was an adventure. I'm glad to be done with it, but yeah, because it's sad. It's interesting, but it's very sad.
Oh yeah.
Now, the next 2 weeks, we're going to get into something a little spookier. And our next episode will be talking about the Egyptians and the mummies and the pyramids.
Are we bringing Myths and Monsters on to talk about
we
mummies?
We should. I'll have to contact Myths and Monsters and see if they'll be interested in joining in. Talk about them mummies. So, thank you all for joining us. You can follow us on Twitter at History